Morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel on how do we make news systems trustworthy. Ashish, Mandy, you can say good morning as well.
Good morning.
Hello.
The joys of virtual conferences. My name is Jonathan Stray. I work now for an organization called the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholder organization centered around best practices for responsible AI. But before that, actually, I worked as a journalist. I was an editor for the Associated Press and did investigative reporting for ProPublica for a while. Today's topic is at the intersection of these two interests. How do we make online news systems trustworthy? So trust in news has fallen over several decades, and in many demographics is now at an all-time low. And yet at the same time, we can't live without news, right? We still need to get news, and a lot of it is mediated through these online systems, such as social media and search engines. So I have with me today a multidisciplinary panel. I have Mandy Jenkins, who's the general manager of the Compass experiment at McClatchy. I have Patricia Lopez, an editorial writer for the Star Tribune, and Ashish Jaiman of the Defending Democracy Project at Microsoft. And unfortunately, Antonio Teixeiras couldn't join us this morning. So I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just say, how does your work intersect trust and trustworthiness in news? So we'll start with Mandy.
Good morning, everybody. So it's kind of a loaded question. Anyone in journalism likes to think that their work is in trust, but I think there's varying degrees as to how successful that really is. So right now, I'm the general manager at the Compass experiment at McClatchy, which is a collaboration between McClatchy and Google to build local news sites that are self-sustaining financially. And trust is a huge part of building up local news. And most of my career is in local news. I've been at mid-sized newspapers, local news startups, and I spent 5 years running the news team at Storyful, which is a social media verification pioneer, and really learning a lot about sort of the disinformation space and in its earliest days. And in that, kind of trying to bring that all back home with what I'm doing now in local news, because we've seen that people trust local news more than national news, but that is not a panacea for the issues facing news. And I recently did a study right before taking this job at Stanford when I was doing a John S. Knight Fellowship there on disinformation consumers. And the people who were sort of the most, I would say, far gone into a disinformation world were those that were less connected in with local news or didn't have local news available. And so that's exactly what we're trying to build in as running local news sites in Mahoning Matters in Youngstown, Ohio, and the Longmont Leader in Longmont, Colorado, like baking in trust and transparency and community engagement from the beginning to try to combat that. So pulling all of that together to try to address this issue head on.
Wonderful, thank you. Patricia, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Patricia Lopez. I'm an editorial writer with the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I have been a journalist for a long time. Started out as a local news reporter, was the paper's chief political reporter for about 10 years, political editor for state and national news for about another 8, and then moved to the editorial board a few years ago, actually, just at the dawn of the Trump administration. So it's been an interesting transition, fascinating for something like this. I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail later, but just in short, I found that, the foundation for trust in opinion journalism is much the same as it is for regular journalism, and that is solid reporting, transparency, adding credibility through how you cultivate sources. Even as an opinion journalist, I make sure that I have sources on both sides. I still feel some obligation to, explore all sides of an issue. not ignore one side completely in favor of my opinion, and having everything rooted in good reporting. I think that's the basis of everything. And showing your work when you can. We do it through linking to original documents online whenever possible.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ashish.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and I'm honored to be talking with Mandy and Patricia on this awesome panel. So I'm Ashish Jaiman. I am a part of in Microsoft what we call Defending Democracy program. We sit in the Customer Security and Trust Organization. I've been with Microsoft 15 years and in many roles, but mostly lately actually have been focusing on this program for the very reason. Our program was stood up because of what we saw in 2016, essentially, where you had external influence operations against disrupting democratic process in the U.S. But this is not the first time. We have seen it in Ukraine, and after U.S. we saw it in Germany, France, and other places. So our program actually sits on what we call 3 pillars: campaign security, so helping political campaigns to improve their cybersecurity resiliency; election integrity, which is again doing the same thing, improving hardening the surface areas for the process of voting. And the last one is disinformation defense. And that's where we start thinking about how we can help mitigate the issues that we see around disinformation in terms of technical solution, but policy and others as well. And recently, we actually announced a program to preserve and protect journalism, especially focusing on the local newsrooms, because we think that local newsrooms are the founding pillars for democracy, because politics is local. Democracy actually works when you talk about local issues to local people. And what we've seen is especially the newsrooms are under a lot of stress. So our program, the new journalism program around local newsrooms, actually we work to provide tools, technology, as well as distribution help to local newsrooms. We also want to make sure that we provide training and tools for integrity of that newsroom itself, right? Because the nation states and other nefarious actors will also target local newsrooms to disrupt their operations. And last but not least, the security and safety of journalists as well as their infrastructure.
Thank you, Ashish. All right, so let's start off at the heart of this. So I imagine many of you in the audience have seen the data showing a decline in trust in news, at least in the US, but also in other countries really over several decades. So what are you seeing that's driving this? Why do you think that news sources have become less trusted as institutions? Is it related to the internet? Is it something else? Why the change? And we'll go in the same order again. Mandy?
I think it's a variety of factors that's made that happen. I mean, for one, there is the internet in the sense that there are way more publishers now, way more voices, which on one hand is great, having a lot more voices, but some of those voices are less trustworthy, but also really intoxicating. And they are occasionally leading people down on an alternate parallel path to what news is doing. And at the same time, the factors that are affecting the business of the news industry are also hurting that trust, because we have less reporters and less editors working on the ground in local communities more than ever. And it's constantly going down because of the financial state of the media. And with less, quote, real journalists and people who have been doing this and had been trusted to do this in the past, and more people who have not necessarily got the public's best interest in mind. I think it's kind of a heady brew that has led to this place where people are going to be less trusting. There's more mistakes getting made because there's fewer journalists. There's stories that aren't being told, communities that are being, in their minds, ignored and maybe actually ignored because there's not actually enough people there to talk to them and to tell their stories and get that full view. So I think that those factors are some of the biggest ones in terms of making people think that they can't trust the news anymore. And maybe they can't. I guess I'm a little biased as a journalist that they should be able to trust news, but I know that there are news outlets out there that have not necessarily had an easy time of figuring out how to build that relationship as well.
Thank you. Patricia?
Well, I'm going to say, as a political journalist, I have been on the front lines of this for a long time. Part of this, I'm convinced, stems from an active cultivation by politicians on both sides, I have to say, to mistrust the news, to disparage news gatherers. It's very easy to kick at reporters, and politicians do it frequently. And this has been going on, at least since the 80s, just a steady hammering away. You can't trust what you read in the newspaper. So that's part of it. It's a phenomenon that predates the internet by many, many, many years. The internet has exacerbated it, along with the eruption of all kinds of, what even is a news site, right? Is it the Star Tribune? Is it McClatchy? Is it Breitbart? Is it Babylon Bee? Everybody now has their own definition. What is a news site? What is a journalist? Are Project Veritas, are they journalists? I would say no, but there are other people who say yes. So it's become very messy. At the same time, I want to say I have some optimism about this, because I see people with a greater trust in some forms of news, a greater appreciation that I did not see years ago. There are people who, with the diminution of local news reporting, have become much more appreciative of what that reporting can do when it looks at local government, when it looks at events. When we had the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, we found that our page views skyrocketed. People were turning to us as a trusted source of information, and that was a really affirming, a little bit surprising, but very affirming development for us. They were searching for what they could trust, right? And they're very active about that. They would look at news sources from across the spectrum and make decisions. And so from my perspective, our job is to make that as easy as we can for them and give them reasons to trust us, give them a firm foundation that they can point to and say, yes, I trust this site because X.
Thank you, Patricia. Ashish?
Yeah, I agree to Mandy and Patricia, but I want to take a step back and say, to Patricia's point, that this is not a new phenomenon. I think it stems to the very fact that there is a vast disparity, right? Inequality actually makes people not trust institutions, right? The things, you can see that there are things which are not working for majority of population across the globe. I'm not just talking about US, but across the globe. And that actually declines trust in institutions, be it government, businesses, non-government agents, as well as media or press. And when you have a lot of trust decay, and this is like happening slowly, eventually to a point where these gaps are filled by mostly nefarious actors and populist leaders, right? Where they start talking about, hey, these things are not working for you, and then eventually get to a point where disinformation becomes a very big tool to spread populist messages. Computational propaganda, disinformation. Again, that's not new as well, right? That has happened since the Stalin days and now. But what is different is all that actually also is amplified with the tools and the scale that we have to amplify those, which is the internet now. So let's go into, hey, this has been happening, but why now? Which is, social media, internet actually helps to spread disinformation with the kind of speed and scale which is like never seen before. Obviously, we all know that. And the difference, again, is the business models, right? the business models, the attention economy, the expectations of consumers, or the conditioning of consumers to get things at no charge, right? So that creates that kind of vacuum as well, where there is a lot of conflict between business model to create algorithms, recommendation engines, timelines, trending, and whatnot to capture as much attention as you can and as much time on the sites. And we have seen in research that false information or disinformation, spreads faster, captures attention of people more. So all that actually adds up now in a very different way. So again, I go back to say, hey, this is not a new problem, but it is accelerated by the very nature of systems that we are in right now.
Thank you, Ashish. And I notice we're starting to get some questions. We'll get to those shortly. Thanks, everyone. Keep them coming. My next question gets to the difference between doing the right thing and being known as having done the right thing. So what is the difference between producing a trustworthy product and increasing trust? Mandy?
That's a tough one, because I think when we make a trustworthy product, we'd like to think that actually leads to more trust. And I think that's kind of where the disconnect can happen, where, the idea of coming in and building something that is supposed to be facilitating trust, and what is exactly what we're trying to do at our local sites, of being, open and responsive to the public, centering on readers and their questions, and being responsive and incorporating them into the work, being transparent about our values, our ethics, our mission, why we do the things we do. And I think there's lots of things that news organizations can and have done to try to build that trust. But ultimately, you're still existing in a world, much just like Patricia said, and she said too, there are all of these factors out there that we're up against when we're doing these things, where we can build a trustworthy product. But whether or not we actually accomplish that, there's a lot of other things that are in our way. And sometimes we're in our own way, of course. Whenever we make a mistake, or whenever we aren't able to cover something that people expect of us, that is going to be a factor in that trust. But we also have third parties that are out there making that difficult. And I think a great example of this is, we've been doing this about a year now at our Ohio site in Youngstown. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary about a week ago. And, we built in all of these things from the beginning with this idea of we need to get this community on our side and on board. And it certainly has worked with a lot of people. But, every single day we are brought into the vitriol about the media on a larger scale from people that live in our community who have problems with the media at large because of all these factors we've discussed. And it's really hard to chip away at that earning the trust. We still have to do it every day. We're still going to have to try to push this out there and make this happen, engage those people. But ultimately, at some point, we may not be able to win people over, even by building a trustworthy product.
Thank you, Mandy. Patricia, your views on the difference between trust and trustworthiness?
Well, I think all you can do is build a trustworthy product. You cannot make other people trust you. There are some elements out there, and I've seen it as an opinion writer. It's part of their brand, part of their ethos not to trust. And they will spread that as widely as they can. We will never win the trust of the entire community, however we define that. I think what's important is that we're centered in what our mission is, how we define a trustworthy product, that we do our best to build that, to adhere to those principles. And people who are open-minded will find reasons to trust us. People who are not won't. And we can try to keep working on that, but we cannot be all things to all people. And it's a mistake for us to try. I just think building the trustworthy product is the most important element of this. Being a trustworthy journalist in terms of dealing fairly with your sources, being transparent about your work. Those are the principles that should guide us. And then whether or not people trust us is up to them. All we can do is give them the reasons to trust us.
Thank you. Ashish?
So I'll start by saying that trust is a currency for the social media companies, the news media organizations, for long-term success, right? So you have to start thinking as like trust being the foundation of long-term success of any business. And especially in the context of online media, the goal of a genuinely trustworthy product is to increase trust and bring facts. And that tool should also improve user experience and deliver authoritative, original content to build credibility. Now, I think as Mandy and Patricia said, there are key attributes to a trustworthy product, and we have to go back to the basics, right? That if you are thinking about earning the trust by a trustworthy product, you have to have attributes of transparency, accountability, fairness, and the tool must be unbiased and reliable. Inclusiveness is also a big point here, right? Because again, you're catering to a large populace. So again, as we start thinking about what does it mean to build a trustworthy product, I think we have to start thinking about, hey, does it have multi-perspective, diversity, opinion, and representation? Is it actually treating the signals, the trust signals, in the right way? And one of the examples I'll give actually, and Mandy knows it as well, like Google and Bing, especially I can talk about Bing, is search is used as a secondary source to vet and verify and validate, right? Typically people go to search engines to vet and verify. Now, to build a trustworthy search engine, Bing, we use signals of authoritative sources, attribution, consistency, multi-perspective, to make sure that we are building that trust layer on our search engine. Now, to Patricia's point, right, we can give all the information to someone and they can choose to not trust, but at least from the trustworthy product perspective, you have to have like those standards, those attributes in the product.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if I could just kind of follow up on a point from that real quick. I think too, there's something that we encounter all the time locally, but as well as in my work when I was at Storyful, is that in doing their own fact checking and the words that they're using in doing that are also going to return what people want. You can find whatever is going to back up that point of view online because there's so much out there, but also that all of our systems are built to give people what they're looking for. That was originally the idea. You're looking for this, but they're finding that, and they can find it whether it's true or not, and whether it's trustworthy or not. So that's another challenge when we're trying to address this on the technology side as well as on the journalism side of things.
Yeah, good point. We talk about that a lot when I teach. The don't go looking for confirmation. You will find it. So a lot of you have mentioned, different audiences, different groups of people who may or may not trust you. So I feel like there's an elephant in the room here that we should address. Trust is a very partisan issue in the US. Should journalists and platforms specifically consider the differences between liberals and conservatives when thinking about trust?
In what way?
Up to you. Is there some way in which we should think about these people differently, or approach them differently, or imagine them as we're producing coverage? All of that.
Tricia, you want to take that?
I would say you have to think about it in terms of really trying to see issues from the two different perspectives, right? And not dismissing one of those perspectives out of hand. I try to look across a broad range of source material when I'm researching a topic, and I will not automatically discount something because it comes from the right or the left. What's important is the information that's being put out there. Can I verify it? Is it useful to me? And then try to explain that in a way to readers that respects the fact that they may be coming at this from a different angle. I don't know if I'm making myself entirely clear, but for instance, in one of our endorsements, when we endorsed for the presidency, we were pretty careful to say that, we were endorsing Joe Biden, for instance, for particular reasons. We understood that not all of our readers are going to agree with that some of them come at this from a very different perspective. And I think just that simple acknowledgement went a little way toward building a little bit of trust and credibility. I'm not going to delude myself into thinking that we're going to win over everybody with that kind of language. But I think sometimes just an acknowledgement that there are legitimately different perspectives to an issue, and each side brings their own facts to this, and we have to be careful about the way we sort through those facts and declare some legitimate and some illegitimate, and just be very mindful of how we're doing that, because that's part of the trap.
Thank you. Ashish?
Yeah, so this is a very, very complicated question, right? But I want to go back to the fundamentals. The question is, should the product, and we, Microsoft being a product company, a platform company, we actually do think about this a lot, especially do a lot of research around this issue area and see how it can actually shape our product. And one thing that we actually want to make sure is have this question that should the product reflect societal biases, or should we change reality to make this product perform in aspirational way? I think that is what the question is. Like, should we keep the differences in mind? But I think if we start thinking in that way as a product, right? I'm not talking about the other, content or user generating on and whatnot. But if we provide a product or create a product that actually starts thinking about, changing the reality, then it will reinforce existing societal biases and may actually make them even worse, right? We actually can become the platform to create echo chambers and filter bubbles, which we actually see and we can talk more about. But so I go back to my original, my previous thought is, to build a trustworthy product, it has to be fair, unbiased, transparent, and accountable, which will not be achieved if you start thinking about building a tool which actually is partisan based, right? Or you bring that thinking into building that product.
The unbiased part is really difficult because that's not something we control. That's for the person viewing us to determine, right? So we can think that we're producing an unbiased product. And I know that people will find bias in terms of who we chose to talk to, how we presented our facts, which facts we presented. So it is no question a minefield. And I don't have any firm answers. Minnesota is as closely divided a state probably as you will find anywhere in the country. Our estimate is that we've got about a 60-40 split among our readers of liberal to conservative. And somehow we have to produce news that attempts to earn trust across that entire spectrum. We haven't found the magic formula yet. If anybody out there has it, I just know that we try every day. We're very mindful of this. We try to walk a line in the center without calling ourselves unbiased, because frankly, in opinion journalism, you don't get to do that. We are pushing a particular point of view. And our challenge is to build trust and credibility in addition to that mission.
Thank you, Patricia. I particularly like your use of the language of recognizing that both sides have legitimacy, even if you, as an opinion journalist, disagree with them. Mm-hmm. Let's hear from Mandy on this.
Yeah, I'm glad to follow up Patricia on that, actually, because I feel like that's something that we run into so much, both of our local sites as well, that, we are doing our best to be unbiased, but, everyone has one. Like, that's the thing. Like, when you're working in the basis of facts and when people have their own facts, but also we do come from a point of view. And I think the main difference we have is that we're trying to put that out there from the beginning. This is our mission. These are our values. This is what we as a news organization are representing. And even though we don't do endorsements, we don't do opinion pieces from our staff on our sites, we do come from a point of view. And I think making readers understand that has been part of our mission to try to be trustworthy. But that also puts you at odds with people. And I think that this partisan divide of sorts that comes when it comes to trust for local news, it manifests itself in different ways as well. Because we get this lack of trust from, I would say, more the extreme edges of the entire political spectrum, and for different reasons. Sometimes it's a media diet situation where there's a narrative that's being pushed by other media out there, I probably don't even have to name, about what's going on locally, that they don't actually have anyone on the ground saying so. And a great for instance of this is we see this manifest itself locally at our Ohio site in Youngstown when it comes to wearing masks. Masks are Ohio state law. You have to wear them. And we approach all of our coverage from the perspective that this is something that you're supposed to be doing. And because we support that, that has now become the partisan weapon being used against us constantly at a local level by local businesses, by local readers who you are just a tool of the left because you support masks. We're coming from a perspective that we're following the law, but and that's kind of just a stand-in for larger.
Mandy, I think you really hit on something important here, and that goes exactly to what I was saying about us remaining centered in our mission and our principles. So we can't deviate from that just because the other side is trying to point to this as an element of bias. We know what's right? We know that is the law. We know that there is scientific evidence backing it up. And I think part of our challenge is to try to reach out to everybody, but not to contort ourselves and stray from who we are and what our principles are. And if I could, Jonathan, I'd like to put in a plug for a word that has fallen into disuse and been disparaged by some, and that is the principle of objectivity. And I'll just quickly define what that means to me. There's a lot of talk a few years ago, journalists can't possibly be objective. Well, to me, it's not it doesn't work that way. It's a discipline, right? Objectivity is what compels me to reach out to the other side to see if they have something that I find useful, that challenges my thinking in some way, that challenges my mindset. It is part of, I think, what keeps journalists from becoming overt partisans, which we can't do, right? I'm an opinion journalist, but I will never be a partisan. I will never completely adopt the mindset of one side or the other. My job as a journalist is to look across the spectrum, gather up everything. I have the great good fortune to have access to people on all sides of an issue. And objectivity is what compels me to take advantage of that and to treat that information fairly. So that's my pitch for restoring objectivity to journalism.
Thank you, Patricia. I like that definition of objectivity as being compelled to reach across and talk to the other side. So this is obviously a hot topic, and we could talk about the partisan nature of trust for quite a bit, but I'd like to go to audience questions now. We'll start with one that's been upvoted a number of times. What's the role of media monopolies in the erosion of trust? And I would add social media monopolies in that list as well, if you want to talk about that. So please just jump in, whoever wants to start with that one.
I can start on that topic, and again, it's like we have to understand that I actually said it before as well. The whole conditioning of us in last 20 years or so, where we expect things to be free a lot, right? And instant gratification of the information that we produce as well as we consume, right? If I post something on Facebook, as an example, or Twitter, or wherever, LinkedIn, in fact, in some cases, I have this expectation that people actually will see it immediately and react to it, right? Be it like, share, or whatever that is. And the platforms actually also try to achieve or bring that user experience to me, right? So that the whole idea of curation, trends on Twitter or curated timelines, recommendation engines on some platform, brings that attention economy to real actual implementation. And that is what I think we have to take a step back and start thinking about that. The harms, unintended harms of algorithms, right? How we take a step back and start understanding the societal problems it may be bringing. And that is where I think platforms just to take that responsibility, start looking at this as a societal issue and see how they can actually help mitigate some of that societal issue by the tools they produce. Because at the end of the day, again, I go back to this whole idea of trustworthy product, right? That we have to, as we are building that product, we have to not only talk about the risks that we see right now, but the unintended consequences based on algorithms and metrics that we define and how to measure those algorithms has to be considered. And obviously, we cannot think of every possible thing, but at least give it a best try to figure out what the risks could be, which we don't know yet.
Thanks. Someone else want to jump in on this, the relation of media monopolies to trust question?
Sorry, I had to let the cat out as that happened. But yeah, I think that this is something that you can especially see in communities where a lot of the media is owned by the same owners. And I don't necessarily think that it's a point of view issue when it comes to media monopolies per se. I mean, there can be, depending on who that owner is. You see things like some of the television operators out there, you'll run into that. But I think really the bigger issue is just the lack of resources and sort of how in some media monopoly places where a lot of the media around a region is owned by the same group, you're going to see the same cuts happening and affecting the trust situation at all of those properties because they're all facing those same issues and they're all trying to just figure out how to get enough news together every day to serve the community as best they can. So I think that's one of the bigger issues that you can run into that's not necessarily tied to just some top-down point of view, which I think is what a lot of maybe readers or people who don't trust media would assume, but it's a lot more, I think, driven by just a resource question.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is that, there's always a danger in media monopolies because they have so much power. I saw something the other day, and I haven't even vetted it myself, so I don't know whether it's true, that Facebook changed its algorithms so that posts from Mother Jones did not appear as frequently. If that turns out to be true, that's a real problem because that's direct manipulation to hide a certain perspective. I think the more pressing issue is just that a lot of these media monopolies on social media just use very simplistic algorithms for popularity. Certain items will rocket to the top of the list, not because they're particularly newsworthy, but because they're weird or they've got some viral quality to them. And suddenly you see that everywhere. You see it across Facebook, you see it across Twitter, it pops up on your Instagram, and you're seeing the same 5 bits of information from different stories over and over and over again to the exclusion of other things that might actually make for a more well-rounded news diet. We don't control that anymore as a local newspaper. We are kind of at the mercy of this. This has been a big topic of discussion in our opinion panel, is how we work with those entities to create algorithms that allow us to flag, for instance, what we think is important, what would be in essence our page 1 story or our above the fold story that we think is of a vital community interest that might be completely eclipsed by the weird crime that happened in 2 counties over.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of pick up on that too, because I think, when it comes to social as well, not only is it a matter of, if someone's kind of intentionally turning down the dial on one point of view or another, but it's the weird stories or the crime stories or something that's just kind of more outrageous that can sort of drown out and especially in the local sense. I mean, right now,
I swear I know every crime that happened in Florida in the last 6 months, and I don't need to.
Every random wild animal sighting.
Yep.
Yeah. But, and I think, we see things like right now, like there's a huge drop in Facebook engagement and referrals for local news. Like we're seeing this at a hyper local level, and like nothing, it's not really reported on. It's not really out there, but anyone who's running a local news site is talking about this. And it's like, is the dial turned down on local news, or is it just that there's so much national and political news that's just sort of drowning out the algorithms of all of our readers to where they can't even find us anymore? And that the fact that we have to ask all of these questions, like, if we had the control of that like we used to, that would be a different story. But now we're sort of at the mercy of these systems where we reach our readers and a big bulk of our readers often, and especially at a local level. And whether it's an intentional turning down or it's just like the nature of news sort of drowning it out, that's a real problem when you might be trying to be the trustworthy source and no one can find you.
And that,
Thank you. So I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to move on to another question here, because otherwise this is the only question we're gonna talk about. But thank you, Ashish. So the next question I'd like to pick up was also upvoted a bunch of times. Would pooling funding for local media from taxpayer money increase trust in the media? And the question notes that this is actually pretty common in other countries, such as the BBC and so forth.
Well, we see that model with PBS and National Public Radio already. I think it increases trust to some extent, but I don't think that just the fact that it's taxpayer money in and of itself makes it more trustworthy or even perceived as more trustworthy. I still think it's the work itself that's going to determine that.
Does anybody on the panel know if PBS and NPR are in fact particularly trusted?
Well, I can't talk about the US, but I can tell you that BBC is very much trusted if you go east of Europe, right? Especially where I was born and raised in India. If it is coming from BBC, it is like the truth. Things may have changed now. I've been here quite some time, but as growing up, that was the basic idea. And I think again, that could be my confirmation bias here as well. And I want to bring that word here because, that is something that one of the things that I have seen is when we talk in these circles, we actually are also creating our own echo chambers here because, we are all talking and sometimes not bring the other side. So when you say, is NPR trusted? I say yes, because I talk to people who are in my echo chamber who knows that it is trusted because we have the same viewpoint. But so that is another challenge, right? So the issue I think goes back to what Patricia was saying is, trust for someone may not be actually, or an organization may not be as simple as saying, hey, it is trusted worldwide or what everyone in the community trusted, but it's very individualistic thing as well. So.
Yeah, I think in Minnesota, is Minnesota Public Radio trusted? Yes, it's highly trusted by some and completely mistrusted by others. So it's just not an across the board thing.
Yeah, and I'll just note that, really any way that we get funded as media has its potential to label a bias for somebody else. That are we biased in favor of our advertising, of our advertisers? Are we biased in favor of our philanthropic funders? If we're being funded that way and what their
the government, if we're getting money from the government.
Yeah, exactly. Taxpayer money is how much is the government influencing you? So in all of these, it does come back to the work. It comes back to the transparency, and ultimately it comes back to the audience and whether or not their own biases are going to be a problem in seeing that.
Thank you. So we have 1 minute left, basically. So I'm going to thank all of you in advance and then throw out one last question, which we won't get nearly as much conversation as we should. Each side brings its own facts. Does this mean that there's no point in fact checking?
No. Always a point in fact checking.
All right, other quick answers?
Everything.
Well, so that is a great point. I just want to close on one thing, which is like, as consumers of information, we should also own the responsibility of making sure that we have the tools and the information, and we look out for disparate information as well.
No, fact checking is still important because people are still looking for them. There are people who look for real facts. So as long as we're still doing that, we can still give them something to find.
Yeah. And one of the ways we do that is by linking to original documents whenever we can. And we've gotten very good reader response from that. They appreciate being able to look at an actual document and making the judgment call themselves, and it adds to credibility.
Well, thank you, everyone. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface on a lot of these issues. Yeah, I really appreciate you all being on this morning and sharing your work with us. Ashish, Mandy, Patricia, thanks so much. And I will see you at the rest of the conference.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.